Revenge game or not? I'm confused. MarkRogersTV and ProFootballCentral.com on Texas A&M and Alabama. This game has yet to be referred to as the game of the century. At least I haven't heard that, so that's kind of refreshing. We haven't had one of those in a few years, and I thought for sure this would be the next one. Back to the revenge thing before we break down the Alabama offense versus the Texas A&M defense, because Nick Saban blasts into his players' heads that this is always a new season, a new team. And his players get it because that's what they've been talking about all week. Anytime asked about revenge, they say this is not revenge. We can't get revenge for last year's game because that was last year's Texas A&M team. We can't play all those guys again. They've moved on, a lot of them, to the NFL and graduated. So we can't get our revenge. So this is not a revenge game. This is about winning a big game in the SEC. That's what Saban has drilled into his players to say. That's what he's saying. But for the entire offseason, the Alabama Crimson Tide, those players have walked into the training room every day in the offseason, basically, and lifted weights, surrounded by monitors, playing the Texas A&M game from last year on a loop repeatedly, over and over, nonstop, 24/7, 365, or about 310. At the same time, even when they try to get their attention away from what happened last year and focus on weightlifting, let's get better for next season, they look at their weight rack and see Texas A&M 29, Alabama 24. Sounds like revenge to me. Okay, this is the way it basically happened last year. A&M, the big underdog on the road, needed to jump on the Tide to gain some confidence, take the crowd out of the game. That was a huge factor in the game, and they did it. Jumped out 20-0. Their defense was never dominant, but got the stops. And, of course, Johnny Manziel just tore up the Tide, especially on the ground. Most of the highlights are the touchdown passes, and he was great through the air, 253 through the air. But it was really the running outside the pocket, finding the running lanes, and burning the Tide occasionally on third down that kept the drives alive. 20-0. And then, of course, Bama made the furious comeback. A.J. McCarron threw 2 interceptions. He threw 3 picks all of last year, 2 against Texas A&M. T.J. Yeldon had the big fumble. McCarron's second pick was the costly one, of course. That intercepted by DeShazor Everett. 4th and goal with Alabama looking to take the lead in the final 5 minutes. And despite the interceptions, despite the T.J. Yeldon fumble, despite the play of Johnny Manziel, it looked like the Tide was set up to go in possibly for the winning score, and it was set up for a big dramatic conclusion with A.J. McCarron possibly leading the Tide to the game-winning touchdown. But that was taken away due to penalty, so we never found out if McCarron was going to do it and if A&M was going to hold on. Because, yes, they did. Whether it was the referees helping them or not, they held on for the victory, 29-24. So here we are, just about 10 months later, Texas A&M, Alabama. We've seen the Aggies play twice. We've seen Alabama play once and gain a lot of criticism for a 35-10 win over a top 35 or 40 team in Virginia Tech. That's because of the offensive line play. Atrocious in that meeting with the Hokies in Atlanta, especially the offensive line. You take a guy like Anthony Steen, who was the poorest of an elite offensive line last season for Alabama. They lose 3 starters. He was the worst of the 2 coming back, with Cyrus Kouandjio as well. Steen graded out as the best offensive lineman against Virginia Tech. Cyrus Kouandjio most likely played his worst game in an Alabama uniform last week. His brother Ari was pulled from the game at one point and subbed in by Kellen Williams. So it was rough for the Tide against Virginia Tech. They only scored 1 offensive touchdown. They had 75 yards out of T.J. Yeldon. A.J. McCarron, 10 of 23. This is a guy who completed 69% of his passes last year. 10 of 23 for $110. Of course, they had a decent lead most of the game, didn't have to throw. But McCarron was sacked 4 times, grounded once, which means basically he was sacked 5 times for big yardage losses, 23 plus. And so Alabama looked bad offensively, certainly in that game. What gives the Tide hope is time. Nick Saban with a bye week to work with that offensive line. The chemistry built during the offseason. Didn't see it in game one against Virginia Tech, but you would have to think Nick Saban, and with the coaching staff that he's put in place, worked like heck to get things in shape and to right the wrongs that they faced against a pretty good Virginia Tech defense. I would have to say that the Hokies most likely will finish the season with a substantially better defense than Texas A&M. It's not a slam dunk. We'll have to see the two teams play. But based on last year's performances, in which A&M had a marginal defense in the SEC, Virginia Tech a much better defense in a worse league, the ACC, but Virginia Tech had 9 starters coming back, and they played well against the Tide. TJ Yeldon, a given. McCarron, a given as well. Amari Cooper, one of the best wideouts in college football. Those guys are in place. Of course, the A&M defense will try to take away the stars, so it's going to be up to a guy like possibly Christian Jones. We saw him completely take apart the Virginia Tech coverage team in the return game, so he's a special player there, but he may need to step up offensively as a wide receiver option. Also, Kevin Norwood, who had a huge game and was McCarron's top target in the national championship game 2 years ago against LSU. You've got Kenny Bell, a guy that quit the team for just about a day a couple weeks ago. He's been a bit frustrated not getting the football with the emergence of Cooper, and a guy that obviously in this offense, nobody's going to catch 100 passes, and Kenny Bell has been a big play guy in the past. Over 20 yards per reception for Kenny Bell in the past. So he's a guy that could only make 2 catches in this game, but could be the difference. So Kenny Bell, DeAndrew White possibly could step up, but I think Alabama needs to find another 2 passing options. Guys that are going to hit for a big play or maybe make 5 or 6 catches in place of Amari Cooper in the passing game, because the stars are going to be the focus for the A&M defense. Okay, this Texas A&M defense did not perform well in the first 2 games against Rice and Sam Houston State. They gave up, I believe, 31 and 28 points in those 2 games. Get some guys back. We mentioned DeShazor Everett with a big interception off McCarron last year. He's a third-team All-SEC performer preseason in 2013. He's back after being suspended for 1/2 of the first 2 games, kind of like the Johnny Football suspension. So he's missed a full football game in the first 2, and he's back, the junior cornerback, for a full game against Alabama, and they certainly need him. Also, sophomore cornerback DeVante Harris, a very talented player, one of the top 10 to 15 cornerbacks coming out of high school 2 years ago, who got a ton of playing time last season and is a listed starter. He will see the field for the first time in anger coming up on Saturday at College Station. Also, senior linebacker Stephen Jenkins, who had 75 total tackles last year, one of the top tacklers on the team. He also had 5.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks in starting 10 games. Stephen Jenkins will be a key in stopping, of course, the Alabama ground game in particular. And junior defensive tackle Gavin Stansbury, don't look for him to make a lot of game-changing type plays, but this guy was a key backup last year and listed as a starter. So A&M gets 4 starters back, 3 impact players plus Stansbury, to a defense that could be a little bit rusty because these guys are getting their first starts of the season. Alabama offense versus Texas A&M defense. And of course, again, Nick Saban and coaching staff have that extra bye week to work the offensive line and fix the problems. We will talk Alabama defense versus Johnny Football and Company in a video post coming up very soon. But for right now, would love to hear from you. First, on the revenge factor. Is this a revenge game? Alabama trying to avenge the one lone loss of last season against Texas A&M. And number 2, the Bama offense versus the A&M defense. Need to hear from you now on MarkRogersTV and ProFootballCentral.com.